Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel, and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. My guest on the show today is Mike Delantes. So Mike is the founder of something called ChronoCards, but that's what he's doing today. He started as a cartographer for an adventure race in Patagonia, so he's come a long way. So a couple of other really interesting points about Mike. He's self-taught. He's a self-taught software developer, and he is a self-taught businessman. And the reason why I mention this is because it means that if Mike can do it, then you can do it too. And as you'll discover later on in the episode, all you have to do is to get really, really comfortable with uncertainty. So this podcast is free to listen to, but it's not free to make. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and also costs money. So my pitch to Mike, and indeed to every business that is featured on this podcast, is the same. If you help cover the costs, I will do the work, and together we'll make something worth listening to, and something that will give more than what we take. And this was the same pitch to Mike. But Mike isn't, a $1 billion business, not yet anyway. And so when someone like Mike says, yes, yep, I'm in, I will help cover the costs. I will help ensure that this podcast continues to be a free resource that anybody can listen to. Well, I really appreciate that. Hi, Mike. Welcome to the podcast. And thanks very much for taking the time to talk with me today. Really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to this. So you are the CEO and founder of something called ChronoCards, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. But as the listeners of this podcast will know, this has got something to do with GIS, something to do with geospatial, and you have a background in that as well. So let's start with that. Perhaps you could just introduce yourself to the listeners, please, and describe how you got involved in GIS, geospatial, and then we'll just go from there.
Yeah. Hey, Dad. Thanks for having me. So I'm Mike Delantis. I live in Western Colorado, and I started as a GIS analyst and now do kind of software development and a handful of other things. But really, I kind of I started my career in GIS as a cartographer for this adventure race in Patagonia. They don't really have a lot of, or at the time, they didn't have a lot of detailed topographic maps for the areas where this adventure race was going. So we go and map that. And then I worked as a civilian for the Naval Facilities Engineering Command, the Park Service, oil and gas, all as a GIS analyst. And kind of like along the way, I self-taught software engineering, just really because I got into it through Python scripting and a desire not to click the same thing 4,000 times. And so since 2016, I've made a living doing geospatial software freelance and consulting. And that's kind of part of what I still do today.
Wow, so you have come a really, really long way. When you say self-taught, what do you mean? Like just reading books? Were you doing tutorials on the internet, watching YouTube videos? How did you teach yourself programming, software development?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was like tutorials on the internet. I took a couple classes in college. Like I had one geoprocessing using Python class, and I think that was actually the only official like collegiate level course I ever had in it. But otherwise, it was really more just knowing that there was a problem I wanted to solve and knowing that it was possible to solve it by looking at what other people had done. Saying like, all right, well, if they were able to solve this problem using X tools, I should be able to do it. And then just kind of pulling out what was left of my hair till I figured it out. And yes, it was very stressful. But I also had somewhat of a technical background. Like growing up, my dad would always teach us like little bits of programming here and there because he's a hobby programmer. And I had grown up just kind of messing around with computers as a hobby. And I went to school for geography, but like all along in the background, I was like, oh man, I should have done computer science, but I don't have the math skills for that, I guess.
Do you feel like, or has there been a point in your software development career where you think, I wish I had more of a, I don't know, a university background in this. I wish I had some sort of official education in this because for whatever reason, I don't understand what these other people are talking about. I don't understand their way of developing software.
Yeah, actually, not even a little bit have I ever really been like, boy, that computer science stuff is over my head. I don't have, if we go into some deep algorithmic things, like, I can get lost in some efficiency type stuff, but a lot of that you can self teach without needing to know the nuts and bolts of it behind the scenes, which don't get me wrong, that'd be great to know. But for like a practical boots on the ground web development background of today, I rarely encounter something that's well over my head that would require, actual college courses to get through.
That's really interesting. Has anybody ever asked for that, or said like, or sort of turned you down for work because you don't have that background?
No, no, never. And it's been more kind of results oriented. And that's really again how I had gotten started was just through scripting geospatial things. And if you're the only person who can script geospatial things, on your team, then that makes you valuable just because you can do it and no one else can. And it's not necessarily that you have to be the best at it. You just have to be the person who's there who can do it.
You know what? I think a lot of people with a that sort of traditional GIS background are going to listen to this and think, "Wow, I could do this too." So I think that's a really positive thing. Okay, so you've come a long way. You started off as a cartographer for this adventure race in Patagonia, I think you said. Then you worked as a GIS technician, analyst, and then later taught yourself how to develop software and worked on sort of freelance software projects. And now you're building this thing called ChronoCards. Pitch me ChronoCards. What is ChronoCards? What does it do?
Yeah, so ChronoCards enables you to manage GIS better by providing activity logs and workflow documentation and reporting tools for ArcGIS Pro. And it's like a little bit of like background on it. As I said, my background is as an analyst, and then I eventually became a software engineer. And there's a really popular software engineering tool called GitHub, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. Most people are, but it logs the things you do in code and lets you document them as you're doing them. And so you can see everyone's activity more or less as it happens. And the deeper into software I dove, the more indispensable GitHub was for collaborating on projects with other members of my team and just kind of figuring out, remembering what I did myself. And I kind of reflected back on my GIS analyst days and thought, like, man, if there was something like this for GIS, it would have saved me a lot of pain because there's just like, there have been no shortage of nights as a GS analyst where I was sitting there wondering, like, how did I do this? Why is it not working now? And it used to work. And the real root of this is that there was nothing that would log exactly what I was doing. And they'll be easily searchable for, months later or for me to look at across the team. And so that's kind of really where ChronoCards started from. It's an ArcGIS Pro add-in that logs metadata about your team's activity in Arc and streams it real time to a web dashboard. And so, like, the example would be that, you and I, Dan, are working together on a project for a big client, and you're doing some sort of complex analysis, and I'm cleaning the data and handling the layout. And we finish it, everyone loves it, and you promptly leave for your dream job, somewhere. You go to New Zealand, perhaps, for 2 months. And, we just don't ever see or hear from you. And later on, client comes back and says, like, hey, we need updates to that project. And I was the one doing just the layouts and kind of the printing and things like that. I'm kind of left holding the bag for this analysis. You didn't write anything down. And so I spent weeks of company time trying to recreate exactly what you did to improve this analysis and pass it off to the client. And, with ChronoCards, I can pull up your exact steps and with comments, hopefully, that you left me to understand down to the individual parameter what you did. And so, I could see exactly what the inputs, the outputs were to geoprocessing tools, kind of exactly what happened. And that is the kind of like invaluable institutional knowledge that we're trying to retain as analysts go from one job to another or analysts just kind of leave because it's difficult to recreate a geospatial analysis if you didn't write down every single step along the way. There are kind of pieces to this where you can pull pieces of this out of geoprocessing history, provided that you still have the APRX file that the process was done in. But geoprocessing history doesn't really tell you the why behind what happened. It doesn't tell you exactly who did it, and you can't leave comments alongside it. So you'd end up just having to open up a bunch of different APRX files, hoping that I find the one that you were working in, scroll back through thousands of operations, find the ones, the exact little pieces that you did, and then cross my fingers that I can reproduce it.
So you said something really, really interesting there. You were talking, well, you said a lot of interesting things, but the last bit there, scroll back through thousands of operations. So I've recently had to do this, looking through GeoServer logs, and you've talked about logging, a couple of times in your pitch there with ChronoCards. Scrolling back through thousands of logs, thousands and thousands of logs, is not always really, really helpful. Yeah. So how do you log things in such a way that is helpful, that I can see what the process was? That I can see, oh, you edited this thing here in some sort of meaningful way. Like I'm sort of struggling with this idea of logs being helpful, but maybe you can help me out with that.
Yeah, I mean, so one part is when you talk about thousands of different operations, it's just too much information for you to really find useful. And one of the things that we allow is, we add context to it, both in terms of the APRX file and who was doing it and the time it was happening. But we allow you to filter by all of those things so that you can pick out just the time that's, just the relevant pieces. And so if I say like, okay, on this example project that you and I are working on before you took off for your dream job, I can know that, okay, about a month before Dan left is when we were really looking for these things. and I know more or less when you left. So I can filter down to that time, filter down to the exact project, even down to the exact layers perhaps that you were using, from ArcGIS Online or from Portal or SDE. Filter down to the exact layers that you're using, and then see just operations that happened on those layers during this time period, so that I'm not stuck scrolling through, several thousand lines of geoprocessing history. I can find just the relevant pieces that I know are that you touched that involve the data that's at hand.
Okay, so I'm going to show my age a little bit. It's been a while since I've worked with S3 products. Back in my day, we had something called an MXD, and I'm assuming that there's something like that in ArcGIS Pro today. Do I have to be working in that same, the equivalent of an MXD in ArcGIS Pro for this to make sense, for those logs to keep updating? What happens if we're both working in different files?
Yeah, so I mean, I can see your work, the steps you take, kind of no matter where it is. And of course, you can turn this on and off. That's a generalization, but ideally, you have it on while you're going through this analysis. And even if you're in a different APRX file, which is kind of like the modern day MXD, if you're in a different APRX file and a different pro project than I am, and you did all your work there, that's kind of where ChronoCards would even come in more useful, because as you leave, let's say that these APRX files that you have, your pro projects get deleted because they were on your C drive or something like that, and the company takes the computer back and nukes it. Now with ChronoCards, we kind of have a geoprocessing history that's stored outside of just that file, so that I would be able to see, the GP ops, and not just the GP operations, but also like the edits and every step of the progress that you made through this project, even without the file itself that, may be long gone.
Okay, so you said stored outside of this file. Where is it being stored? Is it self-hosted? Is it in the cloud? Like where does ChronoCards exist?
Yeah, so most of our customers currently are on the cloud version just because it's very easy for, onboarding. If with the cloud version where we host the data, you as the end user just have to install a ArcGIS Pro add-in, just literally double click it and link it. And so it takes maybe 3 minutes to onboard. So most people use the cloud version. But we do also offer an on-prem version that, you'd have to have your IT department set it up. But the advantage there not only would be that the people, can own their own data, but not only that they would have their own data in house, but we can also log kind of extra pieces about it, more granular data. So if you change, for example, a pipe diameter from 6 inches to 12 inches, we could log that exact change, because then your data is on your server and we don't need to, we're not stuck maintaining sets of your data.
Okay, so that makes sense. We're talking about logs. We're talking about documenting the process. Is any of this reproducible in the same way? Like if I build a model builder model in ArcGIS Pro, for example, yeah, I can run it, and then that's another way of documenting the process as well. I could even go into and look at the geoprocessing history, okay, and see what's happening in there. This could be a form of documentation. Is any of that kind of thing possible within ChronoCards? Can I document and create these sort of reproducible workflows based on what you're logging?
Yeah, so like kind of as you go through the trial and error aspect of GIS, and you're just banging out a bunch of different pieces of the analysis, you can after the fact pull the steps that worked out of your ChronoCards log and group them into an IPython notebook that you can then bring within ArcGIS Pro and run it as an Python script, or annotate it more and kind of share it out with other people on your team. And so this allows you to kind of document the work as you go, either by leaving comments from within Pro, which ChronoCards would support, or you can just go through, run through an analysis, and then, as I said, pick out the pieces after the fact and group them into a standard operating procedure or a training document that is also an IPython notebook, so that you can send it off to someone and they can run that exact analysis. So, actually, going back to the example of you and I working together, if you had ChronoCards and you recorded your analysis as you were doing it, and then you left, I could go back into your ChronoCards log and pick out your pieces of the analysis and group them into a Python notebook, and then run your exact analysis, even without needing to maybe understand the exact pieces that went into it, because I'd have the exact steps you took. Even if I didn't necessarily understand exactly why, they'd all be there.
So yeah, I'm just guessing here, but I imagine something like this would be great for if I was doing freelance work or working with clients, I could produce this documentation and say, well, this is exactly what I've done. This is how the data has changed over time, and you can see my work history. Can I provide people with a dashboard as well? Is there some kind of visualization of what's happening along the way, or is it all just text like lines of log files?
Yeah, through the ChronoCards web app, we have a reporting dashboard that allow you to kind of slice and dice the logs however you need to, and to be able to see progress over time. And this allows you to look at not just your progress, but other people within your team's progress, so that you can kind of work your way backwards, as you were saying, through the data to see. All right, if we started on August 1st and then we made 560 changes to this feature class in SDE, we can see how that data set evolved over time and who was working in it when and which tools were applied to it, which edits were made, and work our way through the data to see almost like an automated log of the metadata, but at a very granular level because we can see exactly who did what and when to this data set. And that would just happen for any data set that you could open in Pro, provided that you had the logging enabled.
So this must be incredibly helpful for remote teams. At least I'm guessing you could all be working on the same or different projects, and you could keep this sort of running record of who was doing what and how they're doing it. And my guess is that like someone in management can come in and check up on things. Has remote work? Have you seen the need to do remote work? Has that sort of created a need for something like this, or did the need exist before?
I think the need definitely existed before. It was just highlighted by remote work. Much like GitHub existed before, and then once we're all remote, being able to see everyone's work without needing to, call someone or pull someone out of a meeting to talk about it, invaluable. But one of the kind of the main drivers, ChronoCards did start before the pandemic, but one of the kind of the first big inflection point we had was right around when companies were sending their workers home. Apple's mapping team does a lot of OpenStreetMap work, and we also support OpenStreetMap. And they sent their whole mapping team home and needed some way to manage the people as they're making edits and as they were changing OSM, to be able to see teams of people working all together. And so they signed up for ChronoCards then, and that was our first kind of big client where we were able to help them manage a team of now remote workers that's happened overnight because virtually everyone was sent home without knowing when they're going to come back into the office. And so we kind of cut our teeth at the start of the pandemic, helping remote teams collaborate. And we still do that today. But I don't think you necessarily have to be remote to still see the benefits of it because, in our example, we're working together. You might be in a meeting, and whether or not you've made changes is kind of holding up my day. It's my blocker for the day is to figure out, all right, did Dan finish these things yet? Is he done with the analysis? Is the data been updated? And with ChronoCards, I could go and look and see if you've done those things without needing to wait for you to get out of the meeting or wait for you to get back from lunch. And so it's still useful even if we are together in the office. But I'd say it's especially useful for remote teams where it's not evident exactly that, when something is finished so that the next part can begin.
So I can definitely see the utility of this. It seems like an absolutely brilliant idea, but not everything is for everyone. What do people say when they push back on this? When you show up and say, "Hey, look, I've got this great tool. It can do X, Y, and Z. It's going to help you in these 7 ways," and they say, "No, it's not for me." What do they say? What do they point out and say, "I don't like this bit about it," or "I don't think that's going to work for us"?
Yeah, one of the bigger objections from, like an analyst standpoint is that it seems a little big brothery, but I would say that the log is far more valuable. Being able to remember what you did and being able to see what everyone else has done, that level of collaboration is far more valuable than any, perception of overwatching this. It's similar again to GitHub where as a software developer, someone can look back and say exactly what I was doing yesterday. And they could use that to say like, oh, you took an hour off for lunch, or they could use it to say, okay, cool, these are, this is when things were happening, this is where we're at. And most people are professionals and are mature enough to be able to say, oh yes, well, I took an hour off for lunch because I my wife was in town and we wanted to go eat, and then I went back to work. And the ability to see exactly what was happening is far more useful than the ability to look over someone's shoulder. And IT departments have way better tools for creeping on people on work machines anyway than we would ever have. So that's kind of like what one of the main objections from analysts, and then from management, the idea that they don't really need to be able to see GIS progress in order to stay on top of a team. And I'd say that that's true to an extent. You don't need to see GIS progress at a granular, like, oh, Dan did this GP operation yesterday. Oh, Dan made this edit yesterday. For sure. Most people are not going to need to dive that deep at a management level. But we also have some trends to allow you to see, like, okay, this is when work is getting done more or less. This is our server response time and things like that. And so, from a management level, yes, we can provide super granular data, and sometimes people push back on that, but the ability to see trends, to forecast when you're going to need extra manpower, or when you're going to, or when the servers are the things that are slowing you down, because we also we log server response times from SDE or from Portal. That kind of information at a high level is still useful, even if you don't need the granular pieces.
Thanks very much. I realize it might feel a bit strange to be on a podcast saying negative things about your product, saying why people why people don't want it, or what people say when they push back. But I really appreciate it, because I think these will be valid arguments for some people. We talked about two different groups there, and if it's okay with you, I'd like to sort of understand how you explain the product to these two different groups of people. Firstly, we had the analysts, and then we had the people in management positions. And I think this might be really interesting for people to understand who are thinking about doing something similar, to understand that the product actually doesn't change, but the messaging needs to change depending on who you're talking to. So I'm curious, what kind of messaging do you use when you talk to an analyst, when you talk to the GIS person who's going to be using the product? How do you sell it into them? And then after that, I'd like to hear the messaging you use when you talk to management, when you saying, hey, this is the product for you, how you explain it to them.
Yeah, I mean, for me, with my background as an analyst, the analyst conversation is always the easiest by far. I think most analysts kind of understand this. They might have the objections that I mentioned earlier, but they understand the utility of it, because we've all been there. So pulling our hair out, very stressed, wondering, like, why does this not work now? I know I did this before. And everyone hates that feeling in their gut when they can just, like, I did this last month, why, what were the pieces, why didn't I write it down? And everyone understands it's kind of like a hallmark of learning GIS. I remember being in the GIS lab when I was a student, just screaming in the middle of the night, like, how is this not working? And the analyst seems to understand, for the most part, that, oh, yes, well, if you can see exactly what you did, then you can reproduce it, at least, for the most part. And this ability to document your workflows automatically as you go, so you don't even have to think about it. Maybe you didn't intend to reproduce this workflow, your analysis. You thought you never use it again, but then you have to go through and do it again. For the most part, to the analyst, once I explain this, the time savings and the lack of frustration is readily apparent.
Perfect. That makes a lot of sense. And to be honest, when you demoed the product for me earlier, I thought the same thing. Wow, look at this. I mean, I get it. I would have had some sort of concerns about privacy. Oh, is someone going to track every move that I make? But I can really see the utility in what you're talking about. Okay, but that's people like us, people with a technical background. How do you explain the same thing to a non-technical person, someone who's sitting in a decision-making role, someone who's in management?
Yeah, so this is where I am weakest, we could say. My background's not in sales. It's not in necessarily even in business, other than just like the freelancing side of it. But the benefits are pretty clear. It's just a matter of communicating them. And so part of this is just saying, like, if you're struggling to quantify your team's impact, in short, I've talked to many managers and just trying to figure out the pain points. And three kind of big ones that came out were, people were struggling to identify when or how much their team was doing in a quantifiable way, something that they could show to their managers and say, yes, GIS is maxed out. No, we cannot double the amount of maps we make next month. Like, no, the server cannot handle any more web maps based on it. This kind of impact quantification and the amount of work that GIS is doing is amorphous, kind of lives in the dark. It's difficult to say exactly how much GIS is doing within an organization. And ChronoCards at least provides some way, albeit a little crude, to say, like, oh yes, well, we've done this many operations, this many edits, this many map exports. We're pretty tapped out. We can't do any more. And so the ability to assign a tangible number to the amount of work that GIS is doing is something that seems to resonate pretty well with managers who are being pressed to do more with less, or to getting pushback against hiring someone else for GIS, even though their department might desperately need it. So that's one of the main points that resonates. The other one would be just, again, the amount of time that can be saved documenting your own work. And GIS managers seem to, for the most part, have come from an analyst background. How far back is another question, but they seem to mostly remember how much time they wasted documenting things or writing SOPs or onboarding new employees and saying like, oh, well, this is how we run reconcile and post at our company. This is how we do X or Y. This is how we run a watershed analysis. And the ability to have that documentation created for you as your senior analysts go through it automatically. So senior analysts would run through a watershed analysis, be able to export this documentation and say, all right, new hire, here you go. These are the exact steps you should take. And that sort of time savings just in terms of documentation and onboarding is another thing that's pretty massive in terms of that's another thing that resonates pretty well with management. And of course, everyone would know like management is pretty quantitative, and so really the numbers, and we have a couple case studies about the amount of time that can be saved and translating that into dollars and things like that. When you get into the nuts and bolts, the numbers and the metrics are really what sell management.
Earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that you didn't have a background in business, that you came from this cartography background, you worked as an analyst, and then taught yourself how to program and moved on to the freelancing side of it. And but now you're running a business. Now you're a founder. And for someone who doesn't have a background in business, it sounds like you've come a long way and you've learned a lot. But there'll be someone out there listening to this going, wow, this guy is, how's he doing this? How did he get started? A lot of people have ideas. Very few of us build businesses around it. How did you know this was going to be a good business, a profitable business? How did you know that you wanted to commit to this and learn all this other stuff that you have to run a successful business? Like, what was your motivation?
Well, yeah, I'm really flattered to hear you say that it's a profitable and successful business. No, I mean things are going pretty well, but no, I mean at no point did I ever really know. I mean, it's still difficult to say that I know, and so there's always a degree of uncertainty that comes with not just working for someone else and taking a paycheck, and a large part of that is just kind of making peace with that uncertainty, and that's something I struggle with all the time. We do have some great clients. We have a pretty stable base of customers, but as we enter into a recession, it's you have to adapt with that, or you have to at least cross your fingers really hard that you can adapt and that things won't go under. And so there is just a lot of uncertainty to it. And saying that I know now, I wouldn't say that I know, but I have learned a lot along the way, as you mentioned. Really, the internet as a whole. I am on some subreddits about marketing, about sales, about just business in general. That has helped a lot. And then watching YouTube videos. I mean, I'm wholly self-taught for business as well. And the biggest thing that's I would say is just you just have to get really comfortable with a lot of uncertainty because you're kind of flying in the dark. I had never sold a product to enterprise users before, like a B2B product, and just learning the whole sales process there was a whole I mean that was there's just as much to learn there as there is to learn for programming. And so when I taught myself software development, thought like that's great, I'm done, it's gonna be a great life. It could have been if I wasn't so foolish as to start this.
What would you do differently? So, how long you been running this business now? How long you been working on ChronoCards?
I think it's been 2 years and 11 months. LinkedIn recently told me. So we'll call it 3 years. Yeah, just before the pandemic, so it feels like 3 years.
So, okay, not focusing on the software side of things. What would you do differently if you could go back in time? What would you tell yourself?
I would definitely talk to more people before building anything. I had built ChronoCards kind of in reaction to a friend's company. A friend has a large geospatial data management company. They generate a lot of data editing company kind of. And he had approached me with the basics of this problem, saying like, "Hey, I've got a lot of people editing stuff, and I have no idea what's happening. There's too many of them for me to keep track of individually. They can tell me what they're doing, but there's just a lot of moving pieces. And so it's hard for me as a manager to see at a high level what is actually happening." And this was 3 years ago. And so I built the initial version of ChronoCards in reaction to that over a weekend, saying, like, oh, cool. Well, I can track some of the things that are happening here in GIS. And I solved his problem probably in the first 2, 3 weeks. Really had a very solid product for his problem. in his use case. And I was like, cool, I'll just keep building things. And so I just kept tacking on features here and there that I thought would be cool, me as the analyst. And they are cool and I do like them, but there wasn't necessarily a business case for it. And so what I would do differently would be, for sure, I would talk to more analysts that weren't me and more GIS managers before going out and building all of these features that turns out people think are kind of cool, but it's not a driver of revenue. It's not a driver of adoption. People see it and they're like, oh, that's neat. But I could have spent a week making one of those features when there was something that would have been way higher impact of an item to create. But instead, I went off and built the features that I wanted instead of the features that my customers want.
I think there's some really, really, really good advice there. What's been the most impactful feature that you've added? The feature where people said, "Yes, that's the thing. That's the thing that I'll pay for."
Hmm, that's a good question. Because right now we seem to be split kind of 50-50 between just the log itself, just the idea of having a centralized log, and the documentation, the ability to pull pieces out of the log and group them into like an SOP or something like that. And so it's still kind of split between those two. The log itself may seem like, oh, well, that's an easy one. That's kind of like the core of the product. But it wasn't always that way, actually. It started as just a dashboard, essentially, that would summarize the stats. And so you couldn't see granular data. You as the analyst couldn't scroll back and see what you did. You could just see that you did X number of operations last week or X number of edits. So I'd say maybe just the idea of presenting the log itself at the most basic, the ability for me to say, hey, Dan, these are the 15 things you did yesterday. So that 3 months from now, when you need to go back and find out, which data sets you touched on today, you could do it.
What has been the most effective marketing strategy that you've tried so far? Without knowing, my guess is that you've tried a bunch of different things because that's what you do when you have a product and, oh, I need to reach more people. So you try all these different things. Maybe you've run Facebook ads, maybe you've tried writing blog posts, maybe you've tried other different things. What's been the best marketing strategy so far? The thing that's worked?
Yeah, I mean, you're correct in that I have tried just about everything. And LinkedIn outreach is pretty high up there in terms of cost to payoff. Like, the ratio there is pretty favorable. But in terms of like the biggest clients that we've won, we're in the Esri startup program, which if anyone's thinking about starting a geospatial startup with Esri things, they should look into. But we're in year 3. Yes, this is our last year of the Esri startup program, and they allow us to have like booths at every conferences in the startup zone, and that has helped tremendously. Just the presence at the conference and having a booth where people can just you can catch their eye as they walk by and chat with them and show them real quickly what it is you're working on. Yeah, conferences have been probably the biggest one, and that might be because we're going for mostly B2B and generally larger organizations, and it's difficult to find those people that you need to talk to, and it's just more organic if they happen to see you and they're interested and then they come to you. You can make more of a true business to business connection face to face at a conference, I feel.
Do you remember your first sale? Do you remember the first dollar you made with ChronoCards?
I do, yes. So it's actually, as I was just saying, my friend's company, the reporting dashboard was the first one, and we undercharged by a lot for per user, undercharged by a ridiculous amount. But his company is actually still a customer of ChronoCards to this day. So they've been here pretty much the entire time from day one to now.
Yeah, I remember doing something similar with some of my businesses. That undercharging at the start, and now I do it like when I start something new, I know that I'm gonna just make a ton of mistakes. I know that I'm going to undercharge, overcharge. Yeah, that it's not going to work out. It's not going to be perfect. And for some reason, that makes it a lot easier for me. It's like, no, this is not going to be perfect. It's probably going to be wrong in some way, shape, or form, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'll learn from that after once I've done it, I'll look back at it, evaluate what I've done, evaluate how it went, the scale of my failure, and I'll just move on from there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there is a certain comfort in just resigning yourself to it that, like, yes, well, the first couple ones are just going to be a wash, but
Yeah.
we'll learn as we go, and it only gets better.
Exactly, exactly. I think it's about getting those reps in, trying things. I mean, not just randomly, but trying things in a specific direction, but waiting for that perfect moment, waiting for that perfect product, waiting for that perfect service or pitch or whatever. It just doesn't happen. Or at least it hasn't happened for me anyway.
Yeah, yeah, actually, I guess to go back to your earlier question, if there's anything else I would tell myself, it would be to start marketing far earlier than I thought I would need to. It had been maybe a year between when I had first launched and when we started marketing in earnest, and that was a mistake. Should have done it even before we had the product. Should have started marketing from day -5, -50, marketing and kind of generating interest ahead of time so that when the day comes that you do get someone who's really interested, you can talk to them, you can build features that will that will solve their problem, and then you're just ready for the next one. So I guess starting everything earlier, not even just software development, but starting marketing earlier to make sure that the product we build is aligned to what people need.
When I think about marketing something before you even have a product, I think of it as like just building up permission to talk to people when you actually have something to say, like building up permission to have their attention. And then later on, when you've got something to sell them, when you need some advice, when you're looking for some feedback, you've got that permission to reach out to them, say, "Hey, look, I've earned your permission. Would you take the time to look at this thing here?" I don't think you need any like I don't think it always has to be a sales a sales pitch every single time. But sometimes just sharing your story, like documenting the journey, that could be a way of marketing before you actually have something to sell.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the things that I do now aren't directly tied to sales. They're just like, oh, well, I feel like we should get something out there that people will be interested in. We should build some things, provide some value so that, as you said, when the time comes that we do have questions that we can ask the community, or when we do have something that we want to put in front of someone, there's some credibility behind it. It's not just, oh, we showed up out of the blue and tried to sell someone.
So we're slowly but surely running out of time here. But I want to ask you. So what does the future of this look like? I mean, are there what features can we expect to see in ChronoCards over the next year or two? What else are you going to be building and concentrating on?
Yeah, ultimately, what we're moving towards is being GitHub for GIS. And what we ultimately want to provide kind of two different things. One is going to be the ability to branch your data to be able to do a lot of editing, maybe across different environments on a feature class from SDE or something in Portal, to do a lot of editing there, keep track of those, and be able to check branches out of the data, kind of like how you can do in GitHub. And I know you can do this to an extent using Esri's tools as it is now, but with branch versioning and things like that. But it's not quite as elegant as what software engineers would be used to with GitHub, where you can just seamlessly check a branch out and apply all those edits to a stack, or you can merge and pick and choose which changes get merged in. And so that's something that's on it's a longer term plan because that involves a much more intimate access to your data, which right now we just kind of log metadata about it. But that would be supremely useful based on just my knowledge and everyone I've talked to. The ability to manage data, geospatial data, the way that you can manage branches within GitHub or Git, and pick and choose pieces would be invaluable. And then the second piece would be to log changes to the data that happen in activity that happens from within ArcGIS Online or a web map, because a lot of editing now happens in the browser, or analysis would happen in the browser from perhaps a less technical user. And even there, it's important to capture changes to the data to see like a holistic picture of what happened. And so support for more devices within the ecosystem, either in the browser when you're on a web map or a web app, or within mobile devices when you're out doing field collecting data, that would be those two things are really the biggest items in our docket for the future.
Because you're building on top of within Esri, is there any part of you that worries about Esri coming for your business some stage, implementing some of these things in their core software?
Yes. I don't have a good answer.
That's an honest answer, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't have a decent answer to that one other than, yeah, like, I'm kinda worried about it, but it's not gonna keep me up at night because what can I do about it?
Yeah, fair enough. I appreciate your honesty there. It wasn't my intention to put you in an awkward situation, but I think it's worth understanding that this is something that maybe you should be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, people have told me before that they're surprised that this already isn't included in Esri, which honestly, I'm also kind of surprised it's not included in Esri. But a large part of our value proposition is just how easily you can go through and find these things. A lot of the pieces that we have are essentially, as I mean, it's no secret, it's essentially geoprocessing history. It's geoprocessing history and edits that you make, both of which Esri has behind the scenes. And you could theoretically develop your own tools in house to rip all these pieces and put them together in a package that it's easy to sort them and filter them and present them and access controlled and everything like that. All the pieces are already there. So in a way, Esri kind of already has all these things. But what we do is package them and present them in a way that's, more valuable and easier for the user.
Packaging is extremely underrated, I think. Extremely important. I think people will pay for convenience as well. So I have access to, I don't know, C++. I could just go and get it, right? And then theoretically I could build whatever I wanted, but I'm not going to because, convenience matters. Packaging is important. It's not the thing that I'm really great at. So I'd be happy to pay for people to do that kind of work for me. Mike, thanks very much for your time. This has been awesome. I really appreciate you sort of walking us through what it is that you're building, how you got started, and what you plan to build on top of it in the future. And also really appreciate just hearing a little bit more about your journey, like the things you think about, the struggles you've had along the way. I hope that this helps somebody else who is thinking about going down a similar path. So thank you very much. Where can people go if they want to reach out to you? If they want to try this out, if they want to dig a little deeper, where should they go? What should they do?
We have a website, chrono.cards, CHRONO.CARDS. Yeah, we snagged a fancy TLD because regular one wasn't available. So chrono.cards. We're also on Twitter at get_chronocards and LinkedIn at chronocards.
Well, you've just got one more follower on Twitter. I'll see you there. Thanks very much for your time, Mike. Really enjoyed talking with you.
All right, thanks. You too, Dan.
So once again, that was Mike Delantis, CEO and founder of ChronoCards. You can visit ChronoCards at CHRONO.cards or check out the links in the show notes. It's probably worth riffing on this idea of uncertainty just for a minute. I think this is one thing that we all have in common. There'll be something about our lives, professional or private, that we are uncertain about. And so when I think about Mike's journey, I'm guessing he's experienced this a lot. You don't go from being a cartographer for an adventure race in Patagonia to running a business and all the things that come with that without experiencing a lot of uncertainty. Mike also mentioned he'd been a freelancer. That is fraught with uncertainty. How much do I charge? Am I doing a good enough job? Will this client come back to me? And I know this from personal experience that uncertainty can be paralyzing. It can stop us from doing our best work. I've had the pleasure over the last 3, 4, 5 years of talking with a few different people that have overcome a lot of uncertainty. People that are self-taught software developers like Mike. People that have started their own GIS, geospatial consultancies, built their own businesses around their skills. None of those people have overcome uncertainty. None of those people are now immune to uncertainty. They've simply learned to live with it. So as someone who has experienced and continues to experience a lot of uncertainty, these stories have really helped me. They've really had a positive impact. It's been great to know that, other people go through this too, and look at them now. So I'll put links to some of those episodes in the show notes today, and hopefully they'll inspire you as well. Okay, that's it for me. That's it for this episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in again this week. I really appreciate it. We'll talk again soon.